Sometimes you have to see to believe and witness history as it unfolds. When the news is breaking, watch with the newsroom of the Washington Post. We explain what's happening and why it matters. Thank you for choosing to watch the headlines as they're being written by our journalists. You can subscribe with a special offer at washingtonpost.com/watch. Subscribing through that link lets everyone here, from the front lines to the control room, know that you care about our continued efforts to inform the public, protect the First Amendment, and foster a healthy democracy. We could not do this without you.
The world is watching to see how far Russia will go to threaten Ukraine. And now President Biden will make remarks on the situation in just a few minutes. We will bring you the president's comments live from the East Room, scheduled for 3:30 Eastern Time. This is a special report from the newsroom of the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. The White House says President Biden will talk about the situation on the ground in Ukraine, also actions the United States is prepared to take, and how a Russian invasion of Ukraine would impact the U.S. and the world. The remarks come as NATO's Secretary General is expressing cautious optimism in the latest signals coming from Moscow. With me now, reporter Rhonda Colvin here in Washington, and from Kyiv, Washington Post video journalist Whitney Shefty. Whitney, let's start with you. You've been reporting from Ukraine for 3 weeks. Tell us about what it's like there in the capital and if tensions have increased while you've been there.
Sure, yeah. Kyiv is this thriving, beautiful city, very modern, large city, and it hasn't stopped. People continue to go out to bars and restaurants, live life as usual. I was at a grocery store yesterday. I was thinking about how, at the slightest mention of snow, or when the pandemic started in DC, all of the water was off of the shelves, all the food was being taken. And here it's like everything is business as usual. We've talked to quite a few people, and I think that over the past few weeks there's growing concern, but I went to the train station today. It did not seem especially busy. We had reporters at the airport. People seem pretty calm and collected overall.
One of the things we're watching are cyber attacks. The Ukrainian government is reporting that one of Ukraine's biggest banks has undergone a massive cyber attack. So how concerned are people there about, infrastructure, banking, being able to access their money?
Yeah, I haven't personally talked to anybody about that yet. And we just started seeing reports earlier today about some of these cyber attacks actually potentially happening. So as far as I know, people are still going on as normal. But I can imagine that will be sort of the first thing that starts to rattle people. If you can't access your money, if you can't use the internet, if you can't communicate with your loved ones, then that certainly could send a sense of alarm.
One other thing, Whitney, there's been a question of how the international community's decision to say to its citizens, like American citizens, leave Ukraine. We won't be able to help you if there is an invasion. And the U.S. is not alone in telling its citizens to leave that country. There's been a concern among some in the diplomatic levels that could send the wrong signals, that it could almost show that Putin has too much power, and it could leave Ukrainians feeling sort of abandoned. Is that something that people are feeling or talking about?
Yeah, a lot of people here sort of say they think that there probably is too much hype going on. We've heard Zelensky sort of push this message, the president of Ukraine, and I've heard a lot of people voice that as well, that, things are fine here. The international community should calm down. Whether that is true or not remains to be seen. But right now, that is definitely the sort of feeling that we're seeing on the ground.
So you've spent time with some of the Ukrainian troops. They've actually been at war for a long time now. What's their attitude and level of concern?
Yeah, so we just embedded with a battalion in the eastern Ukraine on the front lines in Donbass. And, like you said, these people have been at war for a long time, since 2014. And I think a lot of us have sort of forgotten that this battle has been ongoing for all of this time. where we were, they haven't seen a lot of live fire lately, which is, a good thing. But, I think that also means that there's a lot of like, waiting on edge. But they're really passionate and, say that they will be defending their country no matter what. They're thankful for Western assistance, but they also know that this is their battle to fight, and they plan to fight it if they have to.
And Whitney, we're looking at some of your footage right now. Thank you so much. We'll continue to watch all of your reporting. That's Whitney Shefty joining us live from Kiev in Ukraine. Rhonda Colvin, I want to bring you into this. You cover Capitol Hill. Track for us the level of sort of tension and apprehension from members of Congress as they've watched Vladimir Putin's decisions over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, going back to January when things started to get a little serious, started escalating with the number of troops and the moves Putin was making, you saw Congress members get very sober about the situation. There have been a number of briefings on the Hill, both for all members of Congress and also those who are part of relevant committees like the Intelligence Committee or Foreign Affairs. And then you've had most Democrats and Republicans be somewhat on the same page and sort of a cautious unity of saying, President Biden is doing the right thing by showing some strength, telling Putin that we will react. So I've heard that from both Republicans and Democrats. Even Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the Senate, said he believed that Biden was doing the right thing right now. Right now, I think the conversation is shifting a little bit to the idea of sanctions and what Congress can do. They're sort of in a wait and see mode. Currently, there is a bipartisan set of negotiations on a sanctions package, but it appears it's not going anywhere just yet. Senators still haven't quite decided what that will look like. They're also racing against the clock because they do have a pre-planned recess in a number of days. So right now, it's very much a wait and see situation, but both Republicans and Democrats have been, at least publicly, saying that they support the president putting on a strong front right now and showing Putin that the United States stands behind Ukraine.
Let's bring in Ashley Parker, our White House bureau chief. Ashley, what's the anticipation about the president's remarks today?
Well, there's a lot of questions surrounding his remarks, right? One, first and foremost, of course, is, we sort of woke up this morning to reports that Russia was talking about pulling back some of their troops. And I think everyone is eager for President Biden to weigh in on that and just what that means. In talking to U.S. officials, what I've heard is there's a sense that, yes, they know, they're aware of these reports, but they are still sort of in wait and see mode, and it was too early for them to really make a decision, because you have to keep in mind that previously Russia has, for instance, pulled back troops and repositioned them somewhere else. They've pulled back some troops and then added far more troops back for a net increase. So I think one key question, at least that I'll be looking for, is anything that President Biden can say about where things actually stand, especially since from when things last Thursday night really escalated, as we reported, with a impromptu meeting in the Situation Room, and then Secretary Blinken and others coming out with this newfound sense of urgency that Russia could invade. Not that Russia will or would invade, but that it absolutely could invade at any time, including this very week in the middle of the Olympics.
Ashley, tell us more about this Tiger team led by the White House. What does that mean? Who is that group of people, and what are they trying to do?
Sure. So I think everyone watching is pretty aware of what the administration has been doing publicly. And that's been a lot of diplomacy. That's been a lot of deterrence. We've seen, for one of the first times, these sort of information wars playing out in public, where you have the administration deliberately, as a strategic choice, declassifying bits of intelligence and getting them out in the news media to sort of get ahead of a potential false flag attack that Russia could use as a pretext to invade Ukraine, which is all a way of saying this Tiger team that we reported about is, while all that has been going on publicly, privately inside the administration, housed at the NSC, a number of top people have been working on a parallel track to basically be prepared for if Russia does invade Ukraine. They have this whole playbook ready that synthesized about over a dozen papers and intelligence assessments from across agencies of what do we do? How do we respond on day one? How do we respond on day two? What do we do on week one, in week two? And it's not just looking at one scenario, it's looking at a range of scenarios of what Russia might do, from something fairly limited to a much more full-scale invasion where they look to depose the government and seize much, if not all, of the country. And then this Tiger team has also been going through second order consequences. So for instance, if Russia does X and the US does Y, then what happens? How does Russia respond? And how do we respond to that? And they've also been looking through for certain what they call black swan scenarios, which are scenarios that don't necessarily have to do with how we respond or how Russia responds. But what do we do if, while all of this is going on, there is a new, virulent, even more deadly coronavirus strain? What happens if there's a disruption in the global energy supply that has nothing to do with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine? How would that affect things? How would we respond? How might Russia respond? And so that is quiet planning behind the scenes. They've told me they don't want to use that playbook, but they are sort of very relieved that they have it in case an invasion happens.
Actually, obviously so much on the line for Ukrainians if Russia does decide to invade. But what's on the line for President Biden, for his White House team and his administration as well?
It's a great question. You know, this is the first major foreign policy crisis that President Biden has faced after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was a campaign pledge. It was something that President Biden knew he wanted to do since he was President Obama's vice president. But that was an incredibly rocky withdrawal. It was something that upset a lot of our allies. And it was something that hurt President Biden politically. So what is at stake is this is his first chance in the eyes of the world everyone is watching to see how does the US handle this crisis. There's also a sense from some, not all, but from some, that watching what happened with Afghanistan is one of the factors that emboldened Putin to go ahead and make this move. Now, an interesting byproduct of all of this is actually what you are seeing is the US and its NATO allies much more in lockstep. And again, that's not to say that the US wants exactly what Germany wants, what Poland wants, but there is a sense in people I've talked to that in some ways one silver lining is this feels like a very traditional world order of Western and democratic values, where the United States and the US president is taking the lead, and where all of the allies on a macro level are looking to Biden for leadership, and all, again, big picture, want the exact same thing.
Ashley Parker, White House Bureau Chief, thank you so much. We are watching for President Biden, but let's quickly bring in Paul Sonny, national security reporter. Paul, what should we listen for as President Biden speaks?
I think the main thing people are looking for is whether President Biden has any sense of whether the Russian comments about withdrawing troops or whether this is some sort of move towards a de-escalation on Moscow's part. I think people are going to be wanting to know if the administration believes that Russia's signals, which they've sent over the past 2 days, are for real, or whether this is a lot of words and not a lot of action to back it up. So questions like, Russia has said that they are moving their troops back. Is U.S. intelligence seeing that kind of thing on its intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities? Are the satellite photos showing any movement back from the Ukrainian border to back up those comments that were made by the Russian defense minister and the Russian president?
Who is this speech for?
I think it's probably for multiple audiences. I think it's certainly for Russia. I think everything that the White House is saying at the moment, everything that the president is saying is very carefully calibrated as a message to Russia. Certainly it's a message to the Ukrainians, but also, Biden has to be very wary of his domestic constituency, a domestic constituency that for the last 20 years has had Americans at war abroad and is really not interested in any sort of involvement of American troops in any sort of other conflict. Biden obviously has come out and said that he has no intention of putting U.S. troops on the ground.
And Paul, we see the president there. He's literally walking out, so let's go to him now, the president of the United States.
Today, I'd like to provide an update on the crisis involving Russia and Ukraine. From the beginning of this crisis, I have been absolutely clear and consistent. The United States is prepared no matter what happens. We are ready with diplomacy to be engaged in diplomacy with Russia and our allies and partners to improve stability and security in Europe as a whole. And we are ready to respond decisively to Russian attack on Ukraine, which is still very much a possibility. For all the events of the last few weeks and months, this has been our approach, and it remains our approach now. So today I want to speak to the American people about the situation on the ground, the steps we've taken, the actions we're prepared to take, and what's at stake for us and the world, and how this may impact on us here at home. For weeks now, together with our allies and partners, my administration has engaged in non-stop diplomacy. This weekend, I spoke again with President Putin to make clear that we are ready to keep pursuing high-level diplomacy, to reach written understandings among Russia, the United States, and the nations of Europe to address legitimate security concerns, if that's his wish. Their security concerns and ours. President Putin and I agreed that our team should continue to engage toward this end, along with our European allies and partners. Yesterday, the Russian government publicly proposed to continue the diplomacy. I agree. We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed. And I believe there are real ways to address our respective security concerns. The United States has put on the table concrete ideas to establish a security environment in Europe. We're proposing new arms control measures, new transparency measures, new strategic stability measures. These measures would apply to all parties, NATO and Russia alike. And we're willing to make practical, result-oriented steps that can advance our common security. We will not sacrifice basic principles, though. Nations have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. They have the freedom to set their own course and choose with whom they will associate. But that still leaves plenty of room for diplomacy and for de-escalation. That's the best way forward for all parties, in our view. We'll continue our diplomatic efforts in close consultation with our allies and our partners. As long as there is hope of diplomatic resolution that prevents the use of force and avoids incredible human suffering that would follow, we will pursue it. The Russian defense minister reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border. An invasion remains distinctly possible. That's why I've asked several times that all Americans in Ukraine leave now before it's too late to leave safely. It is why we have temporarily relocated our embassy from Kyiv to Lviv in western Ukraine, approaching the Polish border. And we've been transparent with the American people and with the world about Russia's plans and the seriousness of the situation so that everyone can see for themselves what is happening. We've shared what we know and what we're doing about it. Let me be equally clear about what we are not doing. The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well. We're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture. 77 years ago, our people fought and sacrificed side by side to end the worst war in history. World War II was a war of necessity. But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice, or a war without cause or reason. I say these things not to provoke, but to speak the truth, because the truth matters. Accountability matters. If Russia does invade in the days and weeks ahead, the human cost for Ukraine will be immense. And the strategic cost for Russia will also be immense. If Russia attacks Ukraine, it'll be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. The United States and our allies and partners will respond decisively. The West is united and galvanized. Today, our NATO allies and the alliance is as unified and determined as it has ever been. And the source of our unbreakable strength continues to be the power, resilience, and universal appeal of our shared democratic values. Because this is about more than just Russia and Ukraine. It's about standing for what we believe in, for the future we want for our world, for liberty, the right of countless countries to choose their own destiny, and the right of people to determine their own futures, for the principle that a country can't change its neighbors' borders by force. That's our vision. And toward that end, I'm confident that vision, that freedom, will prevail. If Russia proceeds, we will rally the world to oppose its aggression. The United States and our allies and partners around the world are ready to impose powerful sanctions on export controls, including actions that we did not pursue when Russia invaded Crimea in eastern Ukraine in 2014. We will put intense pressure on their largest and most significant financial institutions and key industries. These measures are ready to go as soon and if Russia moves. We'll impose long-term consequences that will undermine Russia's ability to compete economically and strategically. And when it comes to Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that would bring natural gas from Russia to Germany, if Russia further invades Ukraine, it will not happen. While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine, we have supplied the Ukrainian military with equipment to help them defend themselves. We provided training and advice and intelligence for the same purpose. And make no mistake, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. An attack against one NATO country is an attack against all of us. And the United States' commitment to Article 5 is sacrosanct. Already, in response to Russia's buildup of troops, I've sent additional U.S. forces to bolster NATO's eastern flank. Several of our allies have also announced they'll add forces and capabilities to ensure deterrence and defense along NATO's eastern flank. We will also continue to conduct military exercises with our allies and partners to enhance defensive readiness. And if Russia invades, we'll take further steps to reinforce our presence in NATO, reassure us for our allies, and deter further aggression. To be clear, if Russia decides to invade, that would also have consequences here at home. But the American people understand that defending democracy and liberty is never without cost. This is a cause that unites Republicans and Democrats. And I want to thank the leaders and members of Congress of both parties who've forcefully spoken out in defense of our most basic, most bipartisan, most American principles. I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices. So we are taking active steps to alleviate the pressure on our own energy markets and offset raising prices. We're coordinating with major energy consumers and producers. We're prepared to deploy all the tools and authority at our disposal to provide relief at the gas pump. And I'll work with Congress on additional measures to help protect consumers and address the impact of prices at the pump. We are not seeking direct confrontation with Russia, though I've been clear that if Russia targets Americans in Ukraine, we will respond forcefully. And if Russia attacks the United States or our allies through asymmetric means, like disruptive cyber attacks against our companies or critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. But we're moving in lockstep with our NATO allies and partners to deepen our collective defense against threats in cyberspace. Two paths are still open. For the sake of historic responsibility, Russia and the United States share for global stability, for the sake of our common future, to choose diplomacy. But let there be no doubt. If Russia commits this breach by invading Ukraine, responsible nations around the world will not hesitate to respond. We do not stand for freedom. Where it is at risk today, will surely pay a steeper price tomorrow. Thank you. I'll keep you informed.
Mr. President, whether or not they are de-escalating. Ukraine as a precursor to a Russian invasion.
Are they behind the cyber attack, Mr. President?
President Biden speaking just now and not answering those questions you heard from reporters shouted out. But here's what he had to say. The president warned Russia that it will face steep sanctions, pressure on financial institutions and industries, and a united group of countries if it invades Ukraine. However, the president also encouraged continued diplomacy, saying two paths forward still exist. You're watching a Washington Post special report. So those remarks lasted less than 10 minutes, but certainly will resonate. The president saying, if we do not stand for freedom, that the U.S. and other countries around the world will pay a steeper price. With me right now, national security reporter Paul Son. As also, we see John Hudson and Rhonda Colvin. Welcome to you all. Paul, let's talk about the message President Biden delivered. It really was multifold in that he had a message to the American people about how difficult this could be, but he was also speaking directly to Russians and to President Putin.
Yeah, I think some of the critical things he said that we haven't really heard that much before is previously the U.S. had been saying there were around 100,000 troops, 120,000 troops. He's now saying there are 150,000 troops, Russian troops surrounding Ukraine. So that means that U.S. intelligence has some information about an escalation even in the last couple of weeks. He also said that the U.S. doesn't see the pullback of Russian forces that the Russian defense minister mentioned in recent hours. So it seems like the U.S. side is certainly not willing to say that Russia is de-escalating, as Vladimir Putin suggested. And the other thing is that he made it clear, I think, to Russia that he is not going to be deterred by possible consequences to the American population in taking significant sanctions and financial measures against Russia. That's a new message coming from Biden. I think he's trying to tell people that if some of these actions that they're considering are taken against Russia, there will probably be blowback, particularly on the Europeans, but also potentially on Americans in the energy market. And I think what he's trying to communicate to the Kremlin is just because there will be blowback, don't think that I'm not ready to do this.
We'll dig more into what the president said in just a moment. But Paul, before I let you go, you've been reporting on how TikTok, social media has been revealing what's really happening on the ground. We hear one thing, but then these images that are sent out and shared on social media are revealing much more.
Yeah, it's something that actually we saw during the 2014 conflict when Russia first invaded Ukraine. What you found was a lot of Russian soldiers posting selfies, suggesting that they were on Ukrainian territory, even as Russian officials denied that Russian troops were anywhere inside Ukraine apart from Crimea. And this time it's not coming so much from Russian troops. They actually passed a law in Russia banning soldiers from using smartphones and devices in order to prevent those kinds of posts. What you're seeing now is posts primarily coming from people who live in Russian towns near the border of Ukraine, people who are driving on highways and seeing convoys, including tanks and missiles and weapons going by them on the street, moving into fields. And so even as Russian forces are saying that they're not preparing for an invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing this outpouring of posts on social media from people who live in and around the Ukrainian border in Belarus and in Russia, showing that this is in fact happening.
All right, thanks so much, Paul. Let's go to John Hudson now. John, what stood out to you? We heard some details from Paul about what President Biden revealed in that, but what else can you add in terms of the messaging there to the international community and to Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, absolutely. What I heard was a president very much preparing the American public for a potential diplomatic solution. I mean, a lot of the messaging that has come out of the United States and come out of the Biden administration in the last several days has been a very shrill and very alarming drumbeat of statistics about Russia's increasing sort of military posture that is encircling Ukraine very threatening. Now, as Paul pointed out, that still was very much present in his remarks, including that update that we are now at 150,000 Russian troops, according to U.S. intelligence. But he also made very clear that he is pursuing a diplomatic solution and trying to get written responses, which was, of course, that was the preferred format of the Russians. They were the ones who started asking the United States for a written proposal in a written response to their demands that they laid out. Now the United States is in a position where we are waiting for a Russian response, and that is exactly what Secretary of State Antony Blinken conveyed to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov earlier today. And so besides preparing the American public for a diplomatic resolution, which he couldn't guarantee, but he said he was working towards. He was also seemed to be appealing to the Russian public in a way that we haven't really heard before. He made a reference to the sort of kinship between the United States and Russia on the battlefields during World War II as they opposed Nazi Germany. He also said, we're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. That's the type of outreach that we haven't necessarily heard before, but is obviously the type of thing that could come into play if the two sides are getting to a place where they feel like they can have more of a diplomatic solution that de-escalates the crisis, sees more of troops moving away from the battlefield. Importantly, the U.S. has not verified that yet. Things are still on a razor's edge. But the diplomats are working overtime to try to de-escalate this crisis.
John, stay with us. We're going to bring in Rhonda Colvin to the conversation. Rhonda, among the people on Capitol Hill you've been checking in with is the co-chair of the Ukraine caucus. What are you hearing from him about why Americans should be concerned about this? What's on his radar?
That's right. I spoke to Mike Quigley, a representative from Illinois, and he is the co-chair of that caucus. And it's a caucus that's people may not have heard of before this, but it's been around since the late 90s as sort of a coalition of Republicans and Democrats who are concerned and look into policy regarding Ukraine. And I spoke to Representative Quigley about what would you tell Americans who are saying that they don't want to get involved, that they're weary over a number of things, whether it be COVID, whether it be, still the withdrawal from Afghanistan is still very much fresh in most people's memories. What would you tell them? And he said that he would remind Americans that Ukraine agreed to not have nuclear weapons, that kept people safe across the globe, so we have a responsibility to support them. And that was part of the Budapest memo. So he said that's something to keep in mind. And he also said that the United States is not immune to any sort of attacks when there is global turmoil. And we heard the president speak on that, those cyber attacks or the attacks to our infrastructure, our grid. Those are things that are real things that could happen, that could be a part of any turmoil that happens over in Ukraine.
Rhonda, let's pause for a moment and go to Sean Sullivan. He's been at the White House today. Sean, talk to me about what you saw President Biden do just now.
Well, I think we saw the president try to walk a careful line. He was sending signals that showed that, look, we are ready for a diplomatic path. He said we're not seeking a direct confrontation with Russia. He seemed to want to send this message to the people in Russia and the Russian government, too, that there was a diplomatic way out of this. I thought it was notable, though, that he said that he and the U.S. government hadn't independently verified these claims that Russia had made about pulling back some of its troop presence. So I think that's something to watch in the coming hours and days is, what the U.S. intelligence suggests about the validity of that. But he, at the same time, repeated some of the stuff we've heard before, which is, look, if Russia does proceed with a further invasion of Ukraine, the international community will respond. We've heard the president talk about sanctions, other economic pressures that the United States and its allies intend to, try to leverage in that situation. But certainly, overall in tone, I think this was a president who was, suggesting, look, the door is open to diplomacy if you want to take it. The question now is, are the demands that Russia is going to want to see met going to be demands that the international community, the United States, and NATO are willing to meet or even talk about? That's what we don't know at this point.
So we expect to see the White House briefing in just a few moments, Sean, and you will be there, as I understand. You know, we heard some questions shouted out to the president that he did not answer before he left the East Room. One of them was about cyber attacks, and if it is confirmed that Russia is behind the cyber attacks that are being experienced in Ukraine right now, what questions are on reporters' minds?
Yeah, I think they want to know about that. I think they want to know about, what the president is, what, if any, wiggle room the president has when it comes to future discussions about NATO membership for Ukraine, because, of course, that is something that the Russian government does not want to see happen. Now, we heard the president say, look, we will not sacrifice basic principles. He has been a strong supporter of allowing countries to determine their own direction. But, we heard from the German chancellor today who said, look, membership in NATO is not something that's even on the agenda right now. So, in his words, it would be absurd if a war broke out over this. So the question is, does this White House agree with that assessment? Do they think that there are ways to kind of think about Ukraine's relationship as it relates to NATO perhaps differently? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty left by what the president said. He made very, very brief remarks, and as you mentioned, he didn't respond to any of our questions.
All right, Sean Sullivan, thank you so much. We do plan to bring you that White House briefing. We expect it soon, and Sean Sullivan is our reporter at the White House right now. Rhonda, I want to get back to you for a moment. So there is the question of messaging to the American people, and we certainly heard the president bracing Americans for some things that could happen if Russia goes to war with Ukraine and the U.S. has to respond. But he was also sending a message to Russia that he won't hesitate. Talk to us about how he's balancing those audiences right now.
And that really was what was so significant about this speech, because it was only 10 minutes long, a very tight 10 minutes. I think he came out right on the dot at 3:30. But this is the first time we've seen him directly address Americans and also directly address Russians. And in his remarks, he, told the Russians that this would be a war of choice, I believe is what he said. And he's putting the onus on Putin, that it's Putin, it's not us, it's not NATO. No one wants to do this, but it's Putin. So this was a very significant 10 minutes. We've only heard from the president back in January when he gave his first of the year press conference and talked a little bit about Ukraine and the strategy there. We've heard his press secretary talk about it in a number of briefings, but we've never really heard from him in a structured setting like we heard today. So this was a moment for the president to speak directly to Americans, which a lot of Americans may not be clued into this issue, may not be watching it step by step. They're concerned that something might be happening, but may not know all of the things that he ticked off in his remarks there about the idea that an avenue to diplomacy is still a part of what he wants to see. And I've heard that on the Hill, too, that a lot of members are saying, look, we want to try diplomacy. We want that to work. We don't want this to go any further. So some of the things he said, maybe for people following this day in, day out, it wasn't much of a surprise, but he did lay this out in a way that every American who is concerned about any sort of escalation could understand where the president and the White House is right now.
You see that briefing room right there, and I think I saw Sean Sullivan just walk in there, so grateful we could talk to him in between these events today. John Hudson, let's go to you. Talk to us about Ukraine's president and where he fits into all of this.
Yeah, well, so we have this young 40-something leader, former comedian turned president, who has been absolutely tested in fire right now. He has been at the table when it comes to at the receiving end of all this pressure. When you are the leader of a country and you're surrounded, as the president said today, by 150,000 Russian forces, it is designed to be a threatening tactic. It's designed to make you want to make concessions that are more favorable to Russia. What are those concessions that the Russians would like him to make? They want him to swear off membership to Ukraine. They want the Ukraine to essentially stop its westward direction and stop the antagonistic rhetoric against Russia. And it's been very interesting to watch Zelensky operate in recent days. Yesterday, sort of unclear where he stood when it comes to NATO membership. The Ukraine obviously becoming an increasingly westward-looking country sees NATO membership as something that would enhance its security in a way that the Ukrainian people haven't for a long time. But in Zelensky's recent remarks, he has said maybe it is just a dream. And that had people suggesting that maybe he was thinking twice about whether this pursuit of a military alliance, which of course says, the United States would come to the defense of all of its NATO members in sort of a all for one, one for all, Article 5 chartering relationship, that is seen as the true sort of ingredient to security for many countries in Eastern Europe. But as Russia has shown itself willing to really invade neighbors that are looking to become new members. It did it with Georgia in 2008. It did it the first time with Ukraine in 2014. The question is, do the leaders of these post-Soviet states have the stomach to put their people through these really difficult and pressing negotiations? That's what Zelensky's been doing. He's put up a lot of resistance to the Russians at these negotiations called the Normandy format, which recently wrapped up in Berlin. They're going to meet again in the future. And so he's pushed back against the Russians, but he's also pushed back against the Europeans, who also, above all else, want a peaceful situation, and they want the gas to continue to flow from Russia, especially during these very cold winter months. And so from what we've seen so far, we have seen a very interesting Ukrainian leader who doesn't bow at the negotiating table, but also is going to call out even the hand that feeds them in some ways. It's no secret that the Europeans have been funding and donating a lot of money to Ukraine. And Ukraine's government owes a lot to European largesse. That is the same for the United States. And Zelensky was very open about calling out the Biden administration when it was in a state of almost panic, calling out the fact that the Russians are on Ukraine's doorstep and a war could be imminent. Zelensky was very clear, saying he doesn't find that rhetoric particularly helpful. So the overall message is Zelensky has been pretty much beholden to no one except for maybe a small circle of advisors that he leans on. And it has been fascinating to watch a young leader be tested in this way.
All right, let's go back and watch some of what President Biden had to say today. He's trying to walk this line of tough diplomacy. Now, he had to say this about the Russian claims that some military units had moved away from their threatening positions.
The Russian defense minister reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border. An invasion remains distinctly possible. That's why I've asked several times that all Americans in Ukraine leave now before it's too late to leave safely.
That's President Biden just a little while ago. Let's go now to Karin Demerjen, national security reporter with the Washington Post. So, Karin, the president was trying to present this very unified front of many nations against Russia. But let's talk about the reality on the ground. Not every NATO country agrees on a path forward, and what could be next.
I think that right now we're in the situation where, the allies are all talking to each other, trying to share what their assessment is of the intelligence they're getting and what their best guess is based on that of what Russia will do. And I think that, that the fact that you've seen different presidents like Macron trying this his hand at diplomacy, going to Moscow, going to talk to the Ukrainian president as well, kind of shows you that there's different people here trying to reach out and affect this crisis in development in different ways. You've got clearly very strong voice from the United States, from the Brits, saying, this could be really bad. We have not verified that the Russians are telling the truth about their intentions here and whether they really will back off. Obviously, Ukraine, as my colleague John was just talking a minute ago, has been reading the tea leaves in its own fashion and in a different fashion, frankly, than some of these Western allies. And also remember, all of the different countries of NATO have different opinions on what they think the end game of this is, what they think the actual practical reality of Ukraine someday being able to join NATO actually is. And that's kind of what's simmering below the surface as all this discussion goes on. The NATO countries have been actually fairly remarkably unified in their resolve to stand up to Russia, even if it affects energy imports, Nord Stream 2, the businesses too. We were talking about sanctioning banks at a certain point. I mean, these all have spillover effects. But they seem to be willing to at least move, if not absolute unity, at least in parallel and present a rather united front. The question is, though, are they sure that they can be of one mind about what's going to happen next and what move Russia will make? And it's interesting that this is all happening this week because you've got a ministerial meeting, a quarterly ministerial meeting happening at NATO in Brussels this week with all the defense ministers. If Russia was pounding the drumbeat toward war, this could be the moment at which you would see them say, okay, we are going to mobilize the NATO defense forces. We are going to reinforce our borders. But now we've got maybe a turnaround and a stepping back from the brink of war. So are they just going to sit there and watch? This is going to be the substance of that discussion. And we'll see whether, the unity is as strong as it has been as Russia has been plowing forward, or if there's a moment of hedging and saying, okay, wait a second, we have to consider our options and what potential discord there is in that discussion at this juncture.
And we're watching the James Brady briefing room fill up with reporters, and when Jen Psaki goes to the podium, we will bring that to you live. Let's go back to Karin, though, about this, this meeting that's been happening. The defense secretary has been meeting with NATO leaders, and then the plan, go see the troops, right? What is the significance of General Austin being there, Defense Secretary Austin being there, and then also, that moment of seeing the troops and interacting with them and showing sort of the American force?
I mean, that's a fairly standard thing for a defense secretary to do when he travels to that region. I was on a trip with Secretary Austin last fall where he also met with some of the troops. That we have a rotation, basically. We don't have permanently stationed troops in Poland, Romania, but we have a constant presence that cycles in and out with other NATO allies as well. So that's, do it again at this time is to basically, it's a show of resolve. And I think that has been really what we talk about Ukraine and this whole crisis boiling down to what are we going to do about Ukraine? Will we send troops into Ukraine? There, as the president articulated, the obligation of the United States, the treaty obligation, Article 5, is defending NATO allies, of which Ukraine is not one, right? But every time you get this close to the borders of NATO, people start to get a little bit nervous. With the signals of what we will or won't do regarding Ukraine send a signal to our NATO allies about what we may or may not do if Russia decides to trip over another border. Now, the stakes of Moscow crossing a NATO country's border much, much, much higher than crossing Ukraine's border because there is that defensive security agreement there in Article 5 that, all the nations can come in to help the defense in that situation of the nation that's attacked. But the way that Russia's arranged its forces, it has options, frankly. I mean, yes, it encircled Ukraine on many fronts, but as part of that encircling, some of those troops are closer to NATO than they have been in the past, especially the ones they're in Belarus. So there is this general kind of nervousness that is afoot in NATO, even if this Ukraine crisis ends up being resolved. And what the United States does and the gestures that it makes, including the gestures of the Secretary of Defense being there and visiting with troops that are in these border areas, it is important for sending the signal that reinforces what the president's message was in that speech, that the commitment we made to protecting NATO allies, inviolable, sacrosanct, I think is the term that he used, and that we're not wavering from that position.
Karin, the Capitol Hill very well. There seems to be a reduced appetite for sanctions at this moment. Rhonda Colvin earlier was reminding us that they're not here for very long, and there is the reality of deadlines hitting Congress. What are we seeing on the Hill?
I mean, look, you see that both sides have kind of staked their claim. That you've got Republican offers, fresh ones, frankly, that are out today saying this is what we want with sanctions. Obviously, the Menendez bill came out, I think, now over about a month ago. Time is hard to track right now when you are thinking about all the shifting chapters of this crisis. But look, they have been in these discussions about let's find a bipartisan way forward, and we're almost there. We just can't quite agree on what to do about Nord Stream, or we can't quite agree on what sanctions to impose before a potential further invasion by Moscow. Those have been in that sort of stasis of we're not able to quite close the last 1% of the deal for weeks at this point. And keep in mind also that likely whatever comes out of Congress, where yes, it's small margins in both the Senate and the House, but Democrats are still in control and are probably not going to run very far afoul of what President Biden wants, it's probably not going to be the thing that really changes the stakes of what the Biden administration is willing to do. The power of the congressionally endorsed sanctions bill was going to be in messaging. It always was going to be in saying, this is the line, this is what we are as a country, bipartisan basis, are willing to do. Be afraid, Putin, because we will do all these sanctions on your individuals, on your banks, potentially on export controls and things like that. Those are all on the table, right? But when we haven't, you have to make that sort of a statement for it to be deterrent ahead of time and with conviction. The fact that it's been weeks on end now that these negotiations have been going on with no resolution, and that we're now at a point where maybe we're talking about actually heading off the crisis, means that if these debates over the sanctions bill are resolved, it's probably going to pack less punch no matter what it says at this point, given this potential turn of events. Now, of course, if this proves to be a bluff and it proves to be that the Russians are not backing off and that we are not able to verify that they want to go into more of a phase of diplomatic negotiations and we keep marching towards war, then yes, there is a role for Congress to play here in terms of setting a very clear, unequivocal, written in black and white message of what the United States is going to do. But remember, that statement probably is not going to steer Biden very far off course of what he has the power and the instincts of doing anyway, because of that political alignment between the White House and Congress, and also just because of the reality of the way sanctions laws often work. There's national security waivers usually included that let the president, that force the president to impose what's in the bill, but also let him kind of say, except for in this one circumstance, if I have to steer off. And that's why the messaging value that was so vital could be so vital, but if we're backing off, maybe it's just not the moment anymore.
Rhonda Colvin, there's the famous saying of generals are always fighting the last war, right? And there is this question of how much the White House and Congress are thinking about the Afghanistan withdrawal as they talk about how to talk to the American people about Ukraine and Russia and how to talk, amongst themselves about things like sanctions. What is your read on how the Biden administration's track record is factoring in?
Yeah, during that 10-minute speech, I was thinking about that, how large Afghanistan and the withdrawal back in August may be looming over the decision-making and the calculus the White House is facing right now and what to do with this particular situation. I think that could have been behind one of the reasons they wanted to address the public today, to appear to be very open about where their strategy is, to kind of go over some of the basics of where we're at right now, and specifically because the president mentioned that he is imploring Americans who are there to get out. And that's something we heard on Friday, just a few days ago. We heard, I believe, 3 administration officials across the Pentagon, the White House, who were saying Americans get out now. And that's something I think that is reminiscent of August, when there were Americans trapped in Afghanistan and could not get those flights out. And that was something that was, of course, a tense moment. And some of that is still something that members on the Hill are talking about, that Afghanistan withdrawal was pretty messy. So I think that this is a president who, of course, because of his time on the Hill and leading the Foreign Affairs Senate Committee, he's very aware of these types of decisions. But I think perhaps they are applying some of those missteps and some of the messaging that they just didn't get right back in the Afghanistan withdrawal to this current situation.
John Hudson, what are the indicators or markers to really know what's happening in Russia? We heard Paul Sani talk earlier about looking at social media videos, TikTok videos and things like that to get a sense of where Russian troops are, what Ukrainians are experiencing, where Russian troops might themselves be showing, what they're up to. But what are you watching for markers? There's words and then there's actions and movement.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a reason why they have a field of study called Kremlinology. This is not an easy regime to divine what's in the tea leaves at any given moment. And so, there's different people are looking at different things. I mean, Paul's analysis of the TikTok videos and in general sort of social media around this has definitely been invaluable and is extremely important, and to see, what they're what they're doing. Obviously, in some ways actions can speak louder than words, but words are important as well. And I did think yesterday was a very interesting moment where it seemed to be very orchestrated for public consumption when you had Vladimir Putin's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, publicly saying, Mr. President, I do not think that all diplomatic opportunities have been exhausted. I would, recommend that we continue to pursue those. And then Putin saying, yes, let's, I think there are things to do, although there's not a lot of time. I think that was a very interesting moment. It doesn't take an expert Kremlinologist to know that Sergei Lavrov is not where the seat of power is in the Russian system. He is, in some people refer to him as somewhat of a spokesman for Putin from the foreign ministry. He's not a key power broker, but what they were trying to convey, I think, was that they're going for the motions and maybe still open to it. Now, this is potentially a negotiating tactic. You still have all of these Russian forces there and in place, as President Biden made clear. But they are making more sort of open signals about diplomacy than they had in recent days. So it's something to look forward to, but at the same time, the gun is still pointed at the Ukrainian government's head. So we're going to have to stay on this razor's edge for now.
John, about 2 weeks ago, there were U.S. military and intelligence assessments that were shared with lawmakers, also European partners, that showed a very bleak and bloody picture of what could happen in Ukraine if Russia chose to invade. What was the significance of sharing the details of the tens of thousands of civilians that could be killed, the large toll on soldiers, et cetera?
I think there's a lot of significance for lawmakers. An interesting thing that has played out is the Biden administration hasn't had a very difficult time getting the same reaction from both Republicans and Democrats when it came to the briefings that it offered. You had the leadership of the Republicans and the leadership of the Democrats on the Hill say, yes, we believe this is imminent. Yes, this is deadly serious. Yes, we believe that this is almost a foregone conclusion that this is going to happen. As you know, that doesn't happen on Capitol Hill that often. Oftentimes, the executive branch will brief lawmakers and there'll be a total split, and there'll be an opportunity for lots of posturing. There's certainly been fights between Republicans and Democrats about whether or not the administration should be imposing sanctions sooner rather than later. But the analysis that came out of that from the Republican and the Democratic sides was similar. And so that's one thing to consider about the impact of those briefings that had all those grisly details about what would happen in a wartime nightmare scenario. The other reaction that's worth considering is that our partners in Ukraine were extremely frustrated by this, and it has put a significant strain on the Ukrainian banking sector. And so that's why yesterday in Sullivan's briefings on the Hill, he said that the United States would be moving forward for a $1 billion loan guarantee that can hopefully bring some stability to the Ukrainian economy and prevent sort of bank runs, things like that they were really worried about. But overall, I think the worry that the administration might have about going to the Hill and being open is that information being seized on by partisan opponents and having different views coming out of that and different levels of frustration. They seem to have gotten what they wanted out of that this time around. And to be honest, I find it a bit surprising because that doesn't often happen, even in areas of foreign policy.
Karan Demirjian, earlier this week, we saw the German chancellor meet with Ukraine's president. And that's significant because, of course, we were also used to that strong figure of Angela Merkel, who's no longer leading Germany. What is the role of the Germans right now and Chancellor Olaf Scholz in terms of sort of trying to show the Americans they're on board, but also talking to the Ukrainians? There's been some concerns about Germany stepping up.
Yeah, I mean, look, Germany has a really interesting and pivotal role to play here for a number of reasons. One, they're one of the biggest powers in NATO in terms of the European continent, and so what they say really matters. Germany and France have outsized influence in that way, and historically have because of Merkel's role. And Merkel obviously is no longer chancellor, but still there is that. Given the sheer size of the country, the economy, the history there, it's an influential factor. In this particular circumstance, there is the added factor of the fact that Germany has the Nord Stream 2 deal going with Russia. That is this pipeline that's supposed to be, that is a major energy resource in the future. It's not up and running right now, but there has been a lot of hand wringing about, would the Germans be in lockstep with the rest of the West, with the United States sanctions especially, or would they seek to continue this pipeline? Because if they had, it would basically undermine not the entire effect of the sanctions, but it would make them much, much weaker. And the Germans have been fairly clear and advancingly clear that, if Russia does invade, they are going to at least temporarily pull the plug on that project for the duration of the invasion, and they will not act in a way that basically would nullify or enervate some of those the power of that sanctions to affect the Russian economy, which is very, very oil and gas dependent. And so for those two reasons, basically, what the Germans would do, what sorts of signals the chancellor would send, and what position he would take vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, but also vis-a-vis the rest of the NATO allies, has always been a very, very closely watched thing. So it makes sense that he was talking to Zelensky. It was interesting that they came out of that meeting both kind of casting these tones of, hinting about potentially NATO not necessarily being in Ukraine's future, and yet also the fact that Scholz has been very adamant that he's going to not let Nord Stream 2 go forward as long as this continues to be a crisis in development or a potential invasion. So Germans are kind of straddling the fence there in a lot of different ways and have potentially the most to lose out of any sort of Western response to Russian aggression, but thus far have been fairly in lockstep with the United States. And given their position, have a different platform, or you're going to hear different lines coming out of Germans than you will out of Washington. But thus far, playing this sort of central diplomatic role, and yet not breaking ranks with what Biden administration wants to do.
All right, Karen Demerjen, John Hudson, Rhonda Colvin, thank you so much to all of you. We are watching for Jen Psaki to come out any moment now for this briefing. A packed briefing room. The size of how many people are allowed in there has changed with coronavirus restrictions, but you can see a full house, including our own Sean Sullivan there, awaiting to see what Jen Psaki has to say. President Biden speaking earlier today, speaking at 3:30 Eastern Time, talking for just 10 minutes, but laying out a very clear message. One, that the United States will help Ukraine, will not tolerate Russian attacks, but also that he sees a path to diplomacy. Let's go now to the briefing room.
Some exciting updates on our competition agenda. First, we have progress on our administration's effort to lower the price of internet for millions of Americans. I bet you there are people who once lived in apartments, or still do, in this room, who will love this if you haven't already seen it. Today, the FCC announced important steps to increase competition in the market for high-speed internet, which President Biden requested in his executive order on competition. As some of you may know, the landlord, if you live in an apartment, sometimes requires you to purchase internet service from one source. And today the FCC voted on a bipartisan unanimous basis to crack down on exclusivity agreements between landlords and internet providers, known as sweetheart deals, which lock tenants in apartments and office buildings into just one option for internet. That might be good for the landlord and for the internet service provider, but bad for tenants, bad for the American people, bad for people living in apartment buildings who may have to pay more and accept lower quality service. More than a third of Americans live in apartments and condos, and many businesses operate in multi-tenant buildings like office buildings or malls. So this is a sweeping problem the FCC is starting to fix today. And second, a competition update that is relevant for our national security. Today, the Department of Defense released a new report required by the President's competition executive order, explaining that new actions to promote competition in defense contracting. This report details that since the 1990s, the number of aerospace and defense prime contractors has shrunk from 51 to just 5. That consolidation means taxpayers have to pay more for defense services, and it threatens our national security. Strengthened merger oversight is one of the 5 actions the Defense Department is taking to address the problem. We've already seen concrete progress on that front this week. On Sunday, the FTC successfully blocked Lockheed Martin's $4 billion attempt to acquire Aerojet, a proposed mega merger of major defense suppliers. The FTC had filed a lawsuit explaining that the merger would jack up the price the U.S. government has to pay while delivering lower quality and less innovation. Also wanted to note, last item from me at the top, is we're thrilled the Senate did its job today and confirmed the renowned clinical trialist Dr. Robert Califf once again to the job of FDA Commissioner, and once again on a bipartisan basis. He brings to this critical post a lifetime of knowledge and the institutional experience that will ensure he hits the ground running and is guided by the science on critical missions facing the FDA, from continuing to lead the fight against COVID-19 to combating the opioid crisis to ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply. Josh, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Jen. 2 things on Ukraine.
Yes.
First, markets have obviously already been reacting to that situation. Gasoline prices are up 20 cents a gallon over the last 30 days on average. Is the president saying that if people are paying more at the pump, that is essentially a direct result of Vladimir Putin's actions, and he is to blame for the current burst we've seen in higher prices?
Well, the president wasn't making a market assessment or how the market moves. What he was conveying very, very clearly to the American public is that if Russia were to invade and we were to put in place crippling sanctions, that would have consequences or an impact here at home. So I know that wasn't exactly how you were asking the question, but that was what he was conveying in his answer. In terms of the price of gasoline, what we've seen is we know back in December, it went down by about 10 cents thanks to tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, something where there are still releases that have been ongoing. The president also made clear in his remarks that he is open to all options are on the table to help bring down the price of gasoline. But he wasn't making a market assessment. He was just making clear to the public that if Russia invades and we put in place crippling sanctions, that would have an impact on the public.
And then secondly, on Ukraine, the president talked about diplomatic efforts.
Yeah.
Could you go into more detail on what those diplomatic efforts could be? Is this going to be more U.S. interaction? Could there be a face-to-face meeting with Putin? And then how would you define success under diplomacy? Is it as simple as no invasion, or are there broader goals you're looking for, given that everything is now on the table, or more things are on the table?
Sure. Well, on the first part, you may have seen or not that our Secretary of State spoke with Foreign Minister Lavrov earlier today. The President spoke with President Macron earlier today as well. I think the readout just went out to all of you, or it should be in your inboxes as well. And what he means by ongoing diplomacy is that it will continue at the pace and urgency that you have seen from him over the last several weeks and from his team. And some of it will come from the President, some will come from high-level members of his national security team, and some of it will come from our European partners or NATO allies, who we remain in very close contact with. In terms of engagement with President Putin, as you know, he spoke with him on Saturday, and he believes in the power of leader-to-leader diplomacy, but I don't have a prediction of a next engagement at this point in time.
And what about
how
do you define success?
I didn't get to that last part of your question. We define success is, I think, how a lot of our European partners and NATO allies would define it, which would be a de-escalation, a proven de-escalation at the border of Ukraine, where the Russians are pulling back their troops, where they are making clear to the global community, to the media, to the public, that they are not invading Ukraine and backing that up with actions. Go ahead.
I think, Jen, following up on this energy question, in terms of the impact on our energy, which the President mentioned, and then the consequences here at home, what should Americans be prepared for? Worst case scenario, what should they expect if this happens?
Well, I think what the President was touching on was the fact that if Russia decides to invade, there could be consequences here at home, and that could have an impact on energy prices, which could have an impact on prices at the gas pump. And while we are taking active steps to alleviate the pressure on our own energy markets, and every option is on the table to offset rising prices. As you saw the President act last fall, range of options remain on the table. He also wanted to be very clear and direct with the American people about what the impact could be. And the fact that in his view, defending democracy and liberty is never without cost, but we need to convey to the American people exactly what that could look like.
One more on Russia. If President Putin decides not to invade, does President Biden consider that a victory?
I think the world, the global community would consider that a victory. But again, I think what the president's view is and what the national security team's view is that this is ultimately up to President Putin. And every step we've taken up to date over the last weeks and even months to coordinate with our NATO allies, to stay in close touch with leaders in Congress and members about what our plans are, to put together a crippling sanctions package. What we are doing is we're presenting the choice to President Putin. He ultimately is going to decide which path he chooses. Go ahead.
Jen, I just wanted to close the loop on a few things. So the Ukraine has been experiencing a number of cyber attacks today. Yeah. A number of its banks were affected. The defense ministry was affected. Has the United States attributed those attacks to Russia?
I don't have anything on the attribution at this point in time. I know there have been a range of reports. What I can say is that we have been in touch with the Ukrainians, our allies and partners, working with them to deter and respond to malicious cyber activity. We have also been warning for weeks and months, both publicly and in our engagements with the Ukrainians as well as our European partners, about the potential for Russia to conduct cyber operations in Ukraine, but I don't have anything more specific on attribution at this point.
Okay, and just, kind of moving a little bit into the realm of the hypothetical, there are a lot of steps that...
Oh, boy.
I know. There are a lot of steps that Russia could take that are short of an invasion, but that are still, aggressive.
Yeah.
Including cyber, including there's this step that their Congress has taken on recognizing these breakaway regions in Ukraine as being, a separatist, legitimately as separatist regions. Would the U.S. respond to any things like that with sanctions as you would to, an actual invasion?
We have conveyed before, and I'll reiterate now, that we would be prepared to respond with a range of malicious activities or actions that the Russians were to take.
Okay, and then one more thing. I know that you've said that there's very little daylight with you and European allies on this issue. The German Chancellor said today that Ukraine joining NATO is simply not on the table. It's not on an agenda item right now. Is that how you would characterize it from the White House?
Well, I think as you've heard the President convey, and you just heard him convey in his remarks, our view from the United States is that nations have the right to sovereignty, to territorial integrity, freedom to set their own course and choose who they associate with. So we, the United States, we're never going to pressure Ukraine or any country to join or not join a global alliance. That is up to them and up to the other members of NATO. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Just, you say all options are on the table. Let's be more specific on the possibility of a gas tax holiday. Would the White House support doing that?
I have nothing to predict for you at this point, but all options remain on the table.
He said in his speech, if Russia attacks Americans in Ukraine, we will respond. Is there specific intelligence suggesting that some kind of targeted attack on Americans in Ukraine is possible?
I don't think he was suggesting that. I think as we've conveyed, as we've warned, and been very clear about the risk that would be posed to anyone who's in Ukraine, including American citizens, were Russia to invade, one of the biggest militaries in the world, that there would be serious risk to civilians. That's, I think, what he was conveying.
And with the Ukrainian president slated to be out of his country this weekend to go to the Munich Security Conference, do you guys think that's a good idea for him to be gone right now?
I don't think we have an assessment on that from here. Obviously, the Munich Security Conference is an opportunity for any leader to engage with, communicate with other leaders in the world, and obviously the vice president is going, as you know.
You've got a busy day, obviously, with Ukraine, but has the president talked to any Supreme Court nominee? Have any interviews been scheduled? Will they
I'm going to disappoint you here, Ed, and just convey that I think we're not going to give day-to-day updates from here moving forward about whether or not he's done interviews. What I can confirm for you is we're still on track to for the president to make a decision and make an announcement before the end of the month, which is in 2 weeks. He will do some interviews in the next 2 weeks. That's what I can confirm for you. Go ahead, Jackie.
Thanks, Jen. We've been told for a long time that some cyber attacks would likely precede an invasion. So if it turns out that Russia is behind what happened today, or is, I guess how I should phrase it is there work being done quickly to figure out if Russia is behind what happened today so that sanctions can be imposed before there is bloodshed? or is the calculus still sort of centering on force on force or some passing over the
Sure. Well, we are constantly doing those assessments, and certainly as any cyber attack happens, that is certainly a process that happens behind the scenes and that our intelligence community and our national security community undertakes, as it would be in this case as well. I would note, though, as it relates to sanctions, one, there's a range of means that we could respond, both seen and unseen, so it's to a cyber attack or any other attack, and the president has the purview to do whatever he chooses in that regard. But our view remains that the crippling package of sanctions is an effective deterrent. So if you do that all in advance, what is to stop them from moving forward? Now, that may be a different of policy issue, different as of opinion, I should say, on policy issues with some in Congress, and that's okay, but that is our view from the administration.
And then this may or may not be related at all, but is there any information on what caused the power outage on the North Lawn? I mean, every TV network lost power at the same time during
It was a very inconvenient time, I will just note for all of you and for us. I don't have any assessment of that, no, or yes.
And does the White House view Ukraine giving up on NATO aspirations as a possible off-ramp? Understand that the president has said, the administration has said over and over that NATO members would not encourage or would not give up that ability for someone else to join. But they do have a long way to go, and now that there is all of this concern that if there was a member, if they did become members, it could potentially trigger Article 5. Is there any discussion among NATO allies about how significant it would be if Zelensky were to make that offer himself?
Well, we have not raised that from the United States. And again, I would reiterate what I said a little bit earlier, which is that our position is that we are not going to pressure Ukraine or any country to join or not join an alliance, that it is nations have the right to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's a choice for them to make.
Why is the administration encouraging Americans who are or fleeing through Poland to bring proof of COVID-19 vaccination? As I understand it, Poland does not require that. So is there going to be a shift in messaging for Americans who are trying to get out through Poland?
I would check with the State Department on that. I'm happy to follow up for you on your behalf as well. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Jen. I want to circle back to the idea of what de-escalation would look like and how the administration would trust that it were actually real. Do you have a sense of how many troops you would need to actually see with your own eyes through satellite images or otherwise would need to withdraw in order for this administration to feel as though Putin were in fact de-escalating?
Well, I think, Kristen, that is a decision that we would make in partnership with our NATO allies, right, and European countries. And you look at everything from satellite imagery, something that many of you have access to validation and verification of what they're saying they would do. So I'm not going to be in a position, nor would I expect the Defense Department would be, to give you a troop number. But I think it would be very clear if that were a step they were taking.
And I think there have been a lot of mixed messages publicly coming out today. Among them, the NATO Secretary General said that there is cause for cautious optimism when it comes to some of these talks that are happening behind the scenes. Does the administration, does the president share that cautious optimism? Because we heard from the president very firm language.
Well, the president also conveyed it would be positive if it was verified that they pulled back their troops. And certainly the openness to diplomacy is something that everybody should support, and I think our NATO allies would support as well. At the same time, we've seen this playbook before, and especially given the history of President Putin and the Russians, their history of false flag operations, of misinformation, we need to verify.
That's my question. Does the administration share the NATO Secretary General's cautious optimism?
I think I don't think we need to put in more words than what the president just conveyed in a speech to the country.
GOP senators have unveiled a sanctions bill. Have you assessed whether or not this is something the administration wants to see some movement on? Is this something that you would potentially support, given that the bipartisan talks stalled?
Not yet, because it just came out. But again, our view remains that a bipartisan effort would be the best effort moving forward. And as I conveyed to Jackie a few minutes ago, our view continues to be that the crippling sanctions package we've designed is meant to be a deterrent. Go ahead, Ken.
Jen, the Senate's working on this stopgap funding bill. The deadline is Friday. What's the level of confidence that the president will be able to sign that extension by Friday? And separately, has the administration been talking to the two Republican senators who raised concerns, Senator Lee and Blackburn?
We are engaged with a range of Democrats and Republicans, and certainly we are hopeful that we will be able to sign this. I would note, though, that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that one of Senator Blackburn's primary concerns is about a relation to the funding of crack pipes. Is this correct? Which is not an issue. So this is an issue that what is happening here is its potential to hold up funding the government and important programs around an issue that is not an issue, because we've been very clear that we are not providing funding for crack pipes.
And then the Senate Banking Committee had planned to vote on your Fed nominees today.
Yeah.
There was a holdup there. Republicans have objected to Sarah Bloom Raskin's nomination. What does the administration think of this delay? And is the administration going to provide any additional details to Senator Toomey, some of the issues that he's raised?
Well, let me first say that this is in a very extreme step that's totally irresponsible in our view. It's never been more important to have confirmed leadership at the Fed to help continue our recovery and fight inflation. And obviously they have a unique role to play, an important, a vital role to play as it relates to inflation. And I think Democrats and Republicans have agreed on that for decades. So Republicans are out there saying inflation's a problem, it's a huge issue, we agree. And then they're not even bothering to show up to even vote against these nominees to the Federal Reserve. What message is that sending to the American public? So and I would note just on Sarah Bloom Raskin, since you asked me about her as well, she's one of the most qualified individuals to ever be nominated to the Federal Reserve. She's made the strongest ethics commitments in the history of the Fed, even as she's made extensive disclosures to the Banking Committee as a natural part of the process. Senator Toomey has continued to promote false allegations that have already been shot down by ethics experts, the Kansas City Fed, the founder of the Reserve Trust, and Sarah Bloom Raskin herself. So we're going to continue to work with Chairman Brown on a path forward and look forward to the Banking Committee eventually holding a vote to commit these to confirm these 5 nominees. Go ahead.
Is there any entertaining of other options if it stalls in committee? There appears to be some question about whether the Senate as a whole can advance these nominations. Is that something you're exploring, or is that something that you don't think you have the power to do?
You mean in terms of different legislative processes or different?
There's speculation that the full Senate could sort of skip the committee vote if it stalls out and bring them forward.
Sure.
Do you believe that the Senate has that power, or does it have to go through committee?
Our focus right now is on working with Chairman Brown on moving these nominees through the committee.
Can I ask also on COVID funding? HHS briefed Congress this week requesting about $30 billion in funding. Can you give us a sense of, A, can you confirm that? B, what in particular do you need this funding for, and has the existing funding been allocated?
Sure. So HHS's briefing today or this afternoon was a part of our regular conversations with Congress about various resource needs, including what is needed for COVID response. This is important because while we continue to have sufficient funds to respond to the current Omicron surge in the coming weeks, our goal has always been to ensure that we are well prepared to stay ahead of the virus. So we've been in these ongoing conversations about what those needs might look like, and this was a part of that effort. In terms of funds that have been allocated or spent, more than 90%, so available rescue plan funds, which is where the funding has come from to date, have been obligated or allocated. 90% of that has been for purchases of vaccines and therapeutics, vaccine distribution efforts that have gotten shots and arms testing, including for schools and at other high-need locations. Resources from the Rescue Plan and prior COVID response bills have enabled us to respond forcefully to the Delta and Omicron surges. And what we're trying to do now is stay ahead and stay in contact with Congress about what those needs might look like.
Secretary Blinken said yesterday that the U.S. is not on pace right now to meet the president's goal, the WHO goal of vaccinating 70% of the world by later this year. Is any of this funding aimed at jumpstarting global vaccination efforts, and can you talk a little bit about why you're not on pace? Is it, for instance, a supply problem, or is it a problem with what Secretary Blinken called last mile type stuff, getting shots in arms, to borrow language of the college?
That is an undervalued part of it, I should say. So I thank you for raising that part of it. So right now we've shipped over around 440 million doses and are continuing to aggressively share around 10 million doses a week to the world, free of charge. We're the first country to buy doses for the sole purpose of sharing them with the world. We also bought, as you know, 1 billion doses. And Secretary Blinken, I think, made those comments in part because he wants to rally the world to do more. But a big part of our effort right now, and where we have seen challenge, is turning vaccines into vaccination, which means working closely with our partners on the ground and dealing with hyper-local issues countries may be facing to increase vaccination. And this is a big part of the focus of Ambassador Power and USAID's Global Vaccination Initiative. But part of it is that shots in arms component.
Have we started deferring their U.S. donations because the capacity is the problem more than the supply?
There have been moments, yes, where countries are not able to receive the doses that we're able to provide. Go ahead.
Thank you. Creating a gas tax holiday takes legislation.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what are other things that the president can do on his own to mitigate a gas price hike because of Ukrainian conflict? What else can he do by himself? And in terms of releasing oil from the SPR, have you made a determination of how much cost rise that would offset? In other words, what good does it do? Yeah.
Sure, that's a good question, and those are assessments that our economic team is constantly, of course, making. We did see even the anticipation of the release back in December helped lower the price by about 10 cents, but those assessments are constantly being made. In terms of without a decision being made, which I know you're not asking, but just to be clear, there are steps the president has taken in the past, obviously tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. He has also we have engaged with oil-producing countries around the world. That's something we will continue to do because clearly we need to ensure that the supply out in the global market is meeting the demand. And obviously, correct, yes, and that's been a part of our effort, even as we anticipate what impact there could be from an invasion. So, as you know, there's obviously a difference between natural gas shortages and the impact on home heating, which is largely a regional issue, but we have been still, in Europe, but we've been still working with partners on that as well, but also on the supply of gas out in the market. Oil, I should say, for gas. So go ahead.
The president said that an invasion remains distinctly possible.
Yeah.
Some senior administration officials said a couple days ago that as soon as this week. Is that still the timeline, or has anything shifted based on the kind of mixed messages of the last couple days?
We don't have a new assessment. As I think you heard the president say, there's a distinct possibility, but we don't have a new assessment of a decision being made either.
And then I know there have been internal discussions about giving a speech like the one the president gave today for some time. Why today? And then the intent behind it. Obviously, it seemed to be looking to hit on multiple audiences to deliver specific messages to them. Mm-hmm. So why today, and why that range of messages?
You know, Phil, I mean, you all have been covering this very closely, the potential of an invasion, our diplomatic engagements, and there's no question the American people have been consuming what you have been reporting. But I think we felt, and the president felt, it was important to be very clear and direct with the American people about what the impact could be on them, what the consequences would be, what our values are, and why it is important to stand by not just the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country, but also stand among our allies and partners around the world. So it was very important to him to lay out very clearly what's the steps we've taken, the actions we're prepared to take, what's at stake for the United States and the world, and how this will impact us here at home. In terms of why today, it wasn't based on, obviously, as you saw, a desire to put out new policy or based on something new internally. It was just the president's interest in feeling it was time to speak directly to the American people about all of those issues.
And then just last one on the first point that you made there. Is there concern either by the president or inside the White House that perhaps the understanding or support for kind of traditional Western alliances that have been a pillar of the last 80 years is waning or doesn't exist to the degree that it used to?
I think, Phil, Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't have any data assessment of that, but we also are fully aware of the fact that right now the American people are still grappling with a pandemic. They're grappling with rising costs, two big issues the president speaks to quite frequently. And it was important to him to be able to lay out clearly for them what this potential conflict, potential invasion in a place that may feel far away, and how could impact them, how that could impact them, and his engagement. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. President Biden today said there's 150,000 Russian troops encircling Ukraine. That appeared to be a higher number than previously reported. I think 130,000 is how most recently we've seen it characterized. So is the president confirming an actual escalation of Russian troops, or why did he present a new number there?
Well, I think over the last dozen days or so, we've seen a dramatic acceleration and buildup of troops. And so the president said in his remarks very carefully, it's encircling Ukraine on the border and also in Belarus. And so I think he felt it was important to give an assessment of where things stand.
Secondly, regarding a gas tax holiday, you said, quote, all options remain on the table. There is right now a bill from Senate Democrats that would institute a suspension of the gas tax for the rest of the year. Does the White House support that specific bill?
We haven't made any decision about additional steps at this point in time. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Two questions. As you mentioned earlier, Vice President Harris is headed to the Munich Security Conference this week. Does the president plan to also send Secretary Blinken? And if so, would a last-minute addition suggest a different or perhaps reduced or more limited role for Vice President Harris at that conference?
I don't think there's any plans to limit or reduce the vice president's role at the Munich Security Conference or at the global stage. On a global stage, she's going to give a speech while she's there, and she is a vital and important representative for the United States and our values and our intentions at this point in the world. But in terms of plans for Secretary Blinken to attend or not, I can check with the State Department and see. There are plenty of leaders to meet with, so more bandwidth.
On a different note, the president continues to talk about his Build Back Better plan. He did so today, did a couple of events last week. What is the White House expectation at this point about the future of that plan? Is there any evidence of any sort of forward movement, forward progress, even on a pared back version of that? There doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism or action right now on Capitol Hill, but can you talk about what the White House expectation is for that and why the president continues to bring this up?
Well, the president continues to bring it up because as we talk about the impact of inflation, which most people experience in their daily lives as rising costs, one of the ways that we can address that is by passing legislation that will help lower costs for Americans, whether it's child care or health care or the cost of prescription drugs. And we can do that and fully pay for it by making the tax system more fair. So what is encouraging to the president is that there is broad support for lowering costs for the American people in all of those categories and for making the tax system more fair. And we are continuing to work in lockstep and in partnership with a range of senators, and they're having their own discussions about moving these efforts forward. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jen. One question on Asian Americans and one question on Ukraine. On Asian Americans, actually, the Team USA gold medal winner, Chloe Kim, revealed as an Asian American, according to AP, quote, "She was tormented online daily. She said she was consumed by the fear that her parents could be killed whenever she heard the news about another brutal assault on an Asian person," unquote. Actually, under President Biden's watch in 2021, the anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339%. It seems we don't see much action taken by the White House, and even in a press briefing, the very last time you mentioned about Asian Americans was last May. So will the president take some action or even just record a video like what he did last year to raise the awareness?
Well, let me say first that Chloe Kim, I'm obsessed with the Olympics, so I'm just going to give you a little biography here, but she's 21 years old, and she made those comments, which is incredibly courageous and brave that she spoke out about the fear she had, the fear she has for her family members. And she's not the only Asian American to do that, but she is somebody who is now a double gold medalist, amazing. And so I just want to take a moment to applaud her for her courage in doing that. I will say that the president has put in place a task force. He has hired a senior level staffer to be a representative and be someone who can speak to these threats and these concerns and these fears felt by the Asian American community, because there's a number of steps we need to take and continue to take to address. And we've seen this rise, unfortunately, because of hate-filled rhetoric and language around the origins of the pandemic. And that is something that Asian Americans across the country have been feeling. So I can just reiterate for you that the president is absolutely committed to continuing to speak out, to crack down, to take steps, and again would thank Chloe Kim for her courage. Go ahead, Anna. I just have to keep going because we got to.
On Ukraine, Jen, President Biden said that we should give diplomacy every chance to succeed. Secretary Blinken, after his call with Foreign Minister Lavrov, said that a window remains open to resolve this peacefully. On the timeline, how long does the president think that window should stay open if there's no invasion but also no pullback of Russian troops?
Well, what's the alternative if we don't leave the window to diplomacy open? Right? I mean, our objective, obviously, as you heard the president say today, there is no threat the United States is posing to Russia, to the Russian people. There's no threat that Ukraine is posing to Russia. What we're working to do here is leave a forum for de-escalation and prevent a war. And so to us, the door to diplomacy should always be open, and we should always look for opportunities to de-escalate.
Concerned this turns into like a frozen conflict, basically, where troops just stay on the border and there's no invasion but also no pullback?
Well, again, there's going to have to be a continued dialogue and discussion, but Russia not invading Ukraine and not risking and impacting the lives of many, many people in that country, including potentially American citizens, would certainly be a step we would welcome.
What Americans should prepare for, you mentioned the threat of cyber attacks. The president mentioned that as well. And we know Homeland Security has previously mentioned they've seen an uptick in scanning on U.S. critical infrastructure and so on. Should Americans be prepared for a potential Russian cyber attack on critical U.S. infrastructure or other networks?
Well, I would say even before we've been discussing the buildup of troops at the border, and even before we've been discussing the bellicose rhetoric, we have seen an uptick in cyber activity by malicious actors around the world, either those living in countries or the countries themselves. And so that is something, I don't have any new threat or new warning to pose today, but that is something we have certainly been amping and increasing our focus on as a threat that's emerging, but has been the case for the last several years.
Can you take a question on Africa?
Yeah, 1 second, go ahead, and then I'll go to you.
Jen, just this hour, lawmakers put out a bipartisan statement warning President Putin. I know you've said from the podium that the White House doesn't need Congress to pass a sanctions package to implement your own sanctions package, but wouldn't it have sent a stronger message if there had been an agreement reached? What message do you think it sends to Putin that all we got out of Congress was a statement?
I think President Putin knows very clearly, because he's heard it directly from President Biden's mouth, that if he invades Ukraine, that there will be crippling sanctions, and we don't need Congress to act in order to do that.
And when will the president make a decision on any new energy policies to impact prices at the pump? Because even without an invasion, prices have risen beyond where they were before the emergency reserve release back in November.
You're right, and the president is very focused on making sure we're doing everything we can to lower the cost for Americans in any way it hits them, whether it's prices at the pump or when you go buy a pound of meat or wherever it may be. So we're continuing to assess, and he's continuing to look at options. I don't have a prediction of any decision, though. Go ahead. I'll go to you after, Simon. Go ahead.
Switching topics entirely, the president is headed later this week to Ohio. He said that he'd like to be out in communities with people frequently. How often would he like to be out there per week? What do you guys ramp
Every
up
day?
Well, but when he says that, what is your anticipation? Is he looking to travel 2-3 days a week? And when would we expect that to ramp up?
You know, I think you can expect that to increase around the State of the Union and after. I think we are constrained by a couple of things, including the CR funding, but also the fact that there is a whole lot going on in the world. Even though he can be president anywhere, he also has a responsibility to sometimes be in the White House, or oftentimes be in the White House. But he's looking forward to getting out there more in the coming weeks.
Does
he have anywhere specific that he hasn't been yet, or places that he hasn't been, that he feels frequently enough that he'd really like to get back to?
Good question. I would venture to guess that he has probably been nearly everywhere, given he ran for president a couple times and vice president. As president, I don't have any prediction of states or readout of states that he's looking forward to going to, but I'm sure he is looking forward to traveling around the country, blue states, red states, across the gamut. Go ahead.
Africa, you said
Oh, okay, Simon, I'll go to you. Go ahead, Simon.
Okay, thank you. It's been 3 months, so if you can allow me to ask 2 questions. The president spoke with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia on January 10th. It's been almost a month now, more than a month since that call took place. And the WHO yesterday released a statement saying that they still don't have access to the Tigray region for humanitarian access because the government is not allowing them to have fuel. So is the president still interested in anything else apart from Ukraine?
Of course he is. The president has to be a global leader in the world, and he is responsible for not just what's happening around the world, but also what's happening domestically. Let me give you an update or a comment from here. We're hopeful that recent steps taken by the government of Ethiopia and other actors might open a path to resolving the conflict. Over the last month, the Prime Minister has taken steps to promote dialogue, release political prisoners, and enable expanded delivery of medical supplies in the Tigray region. We continue to have serious concerns about the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia, and we are focused on working with all parties to end the source of the suffering, the military conflict. Go ahead, Karen.
President Zelensky tomorrow is calling for a day of unity, a national holiday tomorrow in Ukraine. His message for the last couple of days, if not longer, has been don't panic to Ukrainians. Does the administration have concerns that Zelensky and Ukrainian leaders have not adequately prepared the Ukrainian people for a Russian invasion?
Well, I'm not going to speak to that. What I can speak to is what we feel our role and responsibility is, which is to provide a range of information about what we see at the border, what we see Russia preparing, and our assessment of what impact that could be. Every leader makes their own decisions.
Do you have an update on the humanitarian assistance that the U.S. is talking with European allies, should that happen and the Ukrainian people need that?
Sure. I know Secretary Blinken made an announcement, I believe it was yesterday, about additional assistance. Let me just see if I have any more details on it in here, and if not, I will get that to you shortly after the briefing. Karen, let me just see. Let's see here. Let me get you, I can get you, let's see, so we just announced, a sovereign loan guarantee to Ukraine of up to $1 billion to bolster Ukraine's economy amidst pressure resulting from Russia's military buildup. This builds on the $3 billion in sovereign loan guarantees we issued to Ukraine between 2014 and 2016. We've also committed more security assistance to Ukraine in the last year than at any point in history, $650 million. And we also announced we're launching a new partnership fund for a resilient Ukraine with our with our allies and partners to continue to expand on that. The last thing is the Export-Import Bank has made available $3 billion in support for projects in Ukraine, and the Development Finance Corporation has a current investment portfolio in Ukraine of approximately $800 million across more than a dozen projects. So we've obviously provided a range of assistance, which we will continue to build on. Go ahead.
Jen, will Vice President Harris be meeting with President Zelensky when she's in Munich?
I don't have anything on her planned meetings at this point in time. I expect we'll have more as we get a little bit closer, and I expect they'll do a preview call from her team as well.
And then an Olympics question.
Yeah.
Does the administration have any reaction to the IOC's decision to allow Russian figure skater, and I'll butcher her name, Kamila Galila, to continue competing in the Olympics after her doping scandal?
Well, I would point you to the statement made by the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, who opposed the decision made in Beijing, saying it, quote, appears to be another chapter in the systemic and pervasive disregard for clean sport by Russia. But these were independent decisions made by the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency and Court of Arbitration for Sport. We don't have any additional comment from here. I would point you again to the U.S. Olympic Committee. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the U.S. Energy Information Administration shows data that Russian oil being imported in the U.S. has been increasing over the past year. In May of 2021, it was the most on record. Now, the president said he wants to use all tools to keep gas prices down. Is he looking at temporary things to keep gas prices down should there be a Russian invasion? Or is there any consideration to reversing some of the policies and going back to increasing U.S. energy independence?
I don't have anything to detail for you, in terms of what he is considering, but our overarching objective is to decrease the impact on American consumers and increase the impact on Russian leaders.
Well, you talked about the boycott on the Republicans of the Fed nominees. Does the White House support allowing 4 of the 5 nominees to go through and then dealing with Sarah Raskin later?
Again, we are working with Chairman Brown to move all 5 nominees forward. Go ahead, right there. Go ahead, yeah.
Thanks, Jen. Do you have any update on maybe steps the White House is taking in the event that the trucker protesting in Canada heads to the U.S. and also especially to D.C. around the time of the State of the Union?
Well, our Department of Homeland Security team has been assessing, and I gave an update last week that they also increased support, federal support around the Super Bowl. When there were those reports, I would note the Super Bowl did move forward, and there was no halting of that. So that is a positive development as well. But we are constantly assessing any impacts or any security impacts. But I don't have anything to preview for you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to ask, back to the Supreme Court, the President received a report with recommendations on how to reform the Supreme Court late last year. Has he at all reviewed the report yet and taken a position on it?
It wasn't, I just remind everyone, it wasn't recommendations. It was a broad assessment from across the gambit of scholars from all ends of the political spectrum who were looking at a range of historic issues as it relates to the court. The President has been reviewing that, but I don't have anything to read out for you on that front.
The other thing I wanted to ask you was about voting rights. The President signed this expansive executive order a year ago on voting. I believe Susan Rice put out an update on it in September or October. Could you provide an update on what agencies are doing? We're going to start beginning seeing elections as soon as next month. I believe that's in Texas, but other states are going to start to have them.
Yes, I do have a lot on this, not in front of me. So in terms of what agencies are working on or what they've been working on and what they've basically been doing, so you have more detail on this than maybe others do, but all of the agencies were tasked with putting together their own plans to expand voting access, and they've been working on those plans. They're all at different points in the review process and how it will be implemented. But if you look at past examples where I think it was back in the 90s where if you went to the DMV to renew your driver's license, they would offer you the opportunity to register to vote, stuff like that. But let me see if we can get you something and anyone else who's interested after the briefing. Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. One on China, one on Afghanistan. First of all, China's foreign ministry has been really critical of U.S. rhetoric on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, calling it hyping up the possibility of warfare, saying the U.S. is clamoring for bloc confrontation. What does the White House make of this rhetoric? Are you going to take any action against it, either through talk or other means? And what do you make of this closeness between Moscow and Beijing?
Well, I would say that the meeting that they had a couple of weeks ago reflects an approach both countries have already taken for some time, which is to move closer together. We know, and we've said before, but China's not in a position to compensate Russia for their economic losses, and we have tools to deploy if we see foreign companies, including those in China, trying to backfill sanctions. I would say our overarching view, though, is that if Russia chooses to move forward, it will cost China and how it's viewed in the eyes of Europe and the world. And that's something for them to assess. We are trying to prevent a war here. That is why we are putting information out and why we are engaging with the global community.
How do you respond to Afghans who are critical of the executive order that proposes to split the frozen Afghan money? They say that they weren't involved in the 9/11 attacks, so why are they getting less of these funds that they're entitled to?
Well, I would say that first, let me start with the fact that this is one step in the process. No funds can be transferred until the courts make a ruling. What the President was trying to do was enable certain U.S.-based assets belonging to Afghanistan's central bank to be used to benefit the Afghan people. Otherwise, it would have been held, right? And that money wouldn't have been going. And so that's why we saw it, and he took a proactive step to facilitate access to $3.5 billion of those assets for the benefit of the Afghan people and Afghanistan's future. More than, as you know, many U.S. victims of terrorism, including the relatives of victims who died in the September 11th terrorist attacks, have brought claims against the Taliban. and are pursuing these assets in federal court. So more than $3.5 billion in assets are going to remain in the United States and are subject to the ongoing litigation. But what I think it's important for people to know and understand is he took this proactive step to sign the executive order in an effort to try to provide some of this funding to the Afghan people.
When will that happen?
The courts have to rule in order for it to happen.
$3.5 billion.
Right, the courts have to rule in order for any of the funding to move forward, I believe is my understanding.
How's that proactive then?
He's making clear that he believes that half of the funding should go to the Afghan people for humanitarian purposes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. Will President Biden meet in person with the Russian president?
I think I answered that question a little bit earlier.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki wrapping up that Q&A following President Biden's remarks on the latest in Ukraine. This is a Washington Post special report. I'm Libby Casey. With me this evening in the Washington Post newsroom, Rhonda Colvin. Rhonda, thank you for being here. All right, Jen Psaki wrapped things up there on the topic of Ukraine by saying, we're trying to prevent a war here. So take us through what President Biden talked about today and what Jen Psaki followed up with in terms of the steps the United States is willing to take to prevent a war.
Well, what we heard from President Biden is that there is still appetite and an avenue for diplomacy to fix all of this. That's what we heard in his speech, and we heard her reiterate that too, that there is a path perhaps that the U.S. and NATO wants to take where diplomacy works before anything escalates any further. So that's something that we heard her say a number of times as well. She reiterated that she didn't know specifics on some things, particularly I remember an NBC reporter asking her, well, how are we to know that there's been de-escalation? Is there a number of troops that we need to watch out for? Less troops there in the region? What are we looking for? And she said, you know, they don't have those metrics yet, but this is something that you can certainly tell from the White House perspective is ongoing. But another reporter asked too, why now? Why did the president make this very brief statement, 10-minute statement earlier? And she said the White House felt that it was for the American people, that he wanted to update them. That's something we talked about earlier as well in our pre-show, is that the White House may be calculating that they want to get ahead of any messaging. They want to be transparent to the American people who probably remember just months ago the withdrawal out of Afghanistan after our longest conflict. So those were some of the things that Jen Psaki went over. A lot of questions covering a lot of ground there, but she seemed to just reiterate what the president was saying, which tells us all that the White House seems to be on one page right now and wants to present that to the public.
You know, one of the issues that came up was the question of gas prices for the American people, prices at the pump. And it was I think the first question out of the gate when Jen Psaki began doing her briefing related to that, because President Biden did talk about that potential reality and talked about steps that his administration is trying to take to sort of head off the pain for Americans.
That's right. And President Biden also remarked that if there is some sort of invasion or if the U.S. is involved in protecting Ukraine, that this could be, very painful, and it could translate into higher prices. It could hit our economy. It could hit, fuel. It also, there's the risk of those cyber attacks that he also mentioned. But the gas tax, that was a common question there for those reporters in the room there. And that's something that Democrats on the Hill also have been discussing and pushing for. And that also is because rising prices on everything and the inflation issue, that's going to become, it actually already has, a very big political issue that Biden and the White House and Democrats on the Hill are going to have to come up against in these midterm elections. It's a very vulnerable part right now of the presidency for Biden, the fact that prices are getting up there, and Democrats want to do something to sort of head all of that off.
Well, Rhonda, you talked about the message that President Biden had for the American people. He also had a message for the Russian people and for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, trying to emphasize in his message that we are not your enemy. Let's listen.
The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well. We're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture.
President Biden speaking directly to the Russian people. So, Rhonda, let's talk about the messaging and who President Biden was really trying to speak to today.
He was updating the American people, and he was also telling Russia, just point blank, as we saw in that clip, that no one wants this, that this would be something that Putin chooses if he does indeed invade Ukraine. So that's something that I think was a highlight out of this speech, that he wanted to relay to the Russian people that no one wants this, NATO doesn't want this. It was remarked in this press conference that Emmanuel Macron had a conversation with the president today, and in that readout it said that both France and the United States are supporting each other on whatever might come next, and it's sort of a part of this revolving door that we've seen with Biden and other foreign leaders saying that, they're ready to have Ukraine's back in all of this. And it just underscores that it seems to be the world against Putin. So that's something that the president certainly wanted to have in today's message, that he was speaking to the Russian people about this. And it also reminds me, too, of a piece we had in our paper just a few days ago. It was an analysis piece that looked at the Russians' appetite for any sort of invasion. And it showed a study that saw that only about 8% of Russians want this type of invasion. They don't see this as the same as Crimea. They believe that this is not something that they want to be involved in, nor do they have the right to be involved in. So that's something that Putin may be dealing with his own people, is that they don't have the appetite for this. So perhaps the White House knows that too, and they wanted to hit on that today.
And finally, Rhonda, you are an expert on Capitol Hill. One thing we heard from Jen Psaki was that the White House does not believe it needs Congress to move forward with sanctions, punitive sanctions against Russia. What is the appetite on Capitol Hill right now for any kind of action?
Well, the sanctions package, and we touched on this earlier, that's something that has been in the works for a while. Right now, it seems to be at a standstill. It did have a little bit of bipartisan support, but right now, just in the last few days of this week, before the Senate goes on a President's Day week recess, it seems to be falling apart a little bit. Senate GOP members came out with their own sanctions package just a few moments ago, and from their aspect, they want to impose sanctions immediately, and that's not something that Democrats on the Hill nor the White House wants. And we heard Jen Psaki mention that too, that their stance is that you can't deter prematurely before anything happens, because Putin would feel like he has nothing to lose at that point and he could just go in and invade. So they're sticking to that aspect, although Republicans say we should show a force right now and just impose them immediately. So that's been somewhat of a sticking point between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. But also to note, while this press briefing was going on, the Senate put out a very lengthy and emphatic statement. It's a bipartisan statement coming from the majority and minority leader, along with Senate and Democratic leadership. And they basically say we are behind the White House on this. We're behind any show of force that needs to happen. The last line of the statement says, the United States is prepared to meet this challenge with bipartisan and unified resolve. And I'm sure those watching us and who have watched this Senate this entire year knows that it's pretty significant when you have both parties in that chamber agree together that they're ready for any sort of action that the White House chooses.
All right, thank you so much, Rhonda Colvin. Really appreciate it. That's all for us for tonight, rather. You've been watching live coverage from the newsroom of The Washington Post. So earlier this afternoon, President Biden made remarks from the White House on that crisis in Ukraine, trying to send a message that there is a diplomatic path forward, but also that the United States and its partner countries would not quietly stand by if Russia invades Ukraine. And those remarks followed by that briefing from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, reiterating the president's message. Stay with the newsroom of The Washington Post as we continue to follow this important story. I'm Libby Casey, joined by my colleagues. Thank you for watching.
Sometimes you have to see to believe and witness history as it unfolds. When the news is breaking, watch with the newsroom of The Washington Post. We explain what's happening and why it matters. Thank you for choosing to watch the headlines as they're being written by our journalists. You can subscribe with a special offer at washingtonpost.com/watch. Subscribing through that link lets everyone here, from the front lines to the control room, know that you care about our continued efforts to inform the public, protect the First Amendment, and foster a healthy democracy. We could not do this without you.